Dina Meyer here with Corwin, and I have the pleasure of introducing our three speakers this afternoon. So Douglas Fisher is Professor of Educational Leadership at San Diego State University and a leader at Health Sciences High and Middle College. He has served as teacher, language development specialist, and administrator in public schools and nonprofit organizations, including 8 years as the Director of Professional Development for the City Heights Collaborative, a time of increased student achievement in some of San Diego's urban schools. Doug has engaged in professional learning communities for several decades, building teams that design and implement systems to impact teaching and learning. He's also published numerous books on teaching and learning, such as Developing Assessment-Capable Visible Learners and Engagement by Design. Nancy Frey is also professor in educational leadership at San Diego State University and a leader at Health Sciences High and Middle College. She's been a special education teacher, reading specialist, and administrator in public schools. Nancy has engaged in professional learning communities as a member and in designing school-wide systems to improve teaching and learning for all students. She's published numerous books, including the Teacher Clarity Playbook and Rigorous Reading. John Almarode is an associate professor of education at James Madison University, the co-director of the Center for STEM Education Outreach and Engagement, and the director of the Content Teaching Academy. Prior to his work with schools, he served as a mathematics and science teacher in Virginia. John has engaged in professional learning with teachers and instructional leaders across the globe, integrating the science of how we learn into classrooms in all content areas and across all grade levels. He's also published numerous books on teaching and learning, such as Clarity for Learning and From Snorkelers to Scuba Divers. And because Doug, Nancy, and John have such unique experiences as teachers and leaders, they were chosen to lead a hand-selected group of educators that came together to create the new PLC Plus framework. The PLC Plus framework will provide educators with a refreshed and a reinvigorated model for their professional learning communities. In today's webinar, you'll find out what the Plus is and why the Plus was critical in this new framework. You'll also see clearly the importance of equity as the lens through which the PLC Plus views all learning. Without further ado, I'll turn it over now to Doug, Nancy, and John.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for that excellent introduction. I want to take a quick moment, this is John Almarode, and go through our learning intentions and success criteria for this evening. So here's what our work is today. We're going to learn about the PLC Plus framework, its 5 driving questions, and the 4 cross-cutting themes, and build our initial knowledge around this so that when at the end of the webinar, we'll be able to identify the needs of your current PLC and the strengths and growth opportunities within those PLCs. Those are our learning intentions and success criteria for today.
Professional learning communities have been around for several decades. This is not a new initiative. It's also not a flash in the pan. People have been working on designing, evaluating, implementing, and modifying professional learning communities for many decades. And over the course of those decades, we've learned a lot about what it takes for a PLC to be effective and impactful. The purpose of a PLC, a community of people coming together, is for continuous learning, not just of students, but all educators. And that we engage in some collegial inquiry. We learn about our practices, and we learn that our practices impact learning. We identify areas that need attention, and this is an important area. When we say in areas that need attention, it's not just intervention. The risk is that we put all of the students who struggle with the learning in an intervention and never consider the ways in which barriers need to be removed. And as we explore the PLC Plus model, yes, we do recommend there are times to intervene with students, but there are also times where we analyze the barriers that are in place for kids and how we can remove some of those barriers. The last purpose is as a team, as a community, we explore and support each other's learning as adults. A quote we like: an effective professional learning community has the capacity to promote and sustain the learning of all professionals in the school community with the collective purpose of enhancing pupil learning. And we like this definition from a while back because it identifies this dual practice, this dual idea here, that an effective community that comes together ensures that the grown-ups learn as much as the students learn. Unfortunately, not all professional learning communities live up to that promise. In fact, some models don't allow for conversations about the teacher's learnings. What did I learn today about my teaching and about the impact that my teaching has on our students? Some things that are called professional learning communities end up being busy meetings or sessions to air grievances about all things wrong, or finger pointing about specific students, or only using intervention, so an RTI model only, not looking at removals of barriers.
As Doug had noted, there are a lot of really positive efforts that have come out of professional learning community organizations. But going 40 years in now to that work, we also collectively, all of us have experienced some places where, quite honestly, the PLC impact, the potential for that impact has been limited. And we'd love to turn this over to all of you for a few moments. Can you put in the chat box some of the reasons you think can happen that PLC will lack the kind of impact that it potentially could have? What do you find to be some of the barriers or some of the limits? Stephanie says, too many initiatives.
Naysayers can't get focus.
Kylie says, not asking the right questions.
Meg says, not realistic norms have been set.
Jennifer notes that the meetings sometimes can be unstructured. Or as Jennifer says, there isn't a designated time. It's just supposed to happen, but there might not be time set aside to be able to do it.
And what teachers call non-learners. We also see comments about lack of curriculum alignment, lack of teacher ownership, time, and that being top-down versus teacher-initiated.
I also noticed too, Carl said that sometimes those PLCs are held on days when lots of staff are absent. I wonder, Carl, if it's actually the other way around. I know there's going to be a PLC meeting today. What a perfect day for me to not be at school.
Patricia says it becomes a catch-all phrase for everything that teachers need to get done. Lack of training, lack of focus, lack of guidance, lack of clarity, lack of purpose, lack of structure. We're seeing a lot of things. Not having protocols for discussions, time, the mindset of people.
Not valued, not linked to the daily work. Boy, I think that's really important. A lack of sincerity. Jackie says it's looked at as being just one more thing to do on an already full plate. There are too many other priorities that end up getting in the way. And Amy notes, not meeting often enough.
Yep, we all have seen reasons why these discussions are not resulting in the impact that we need to see for our students. We want to move that. One of the things we think is missing from most professional learning communities' conversations is teaching. In fact, in many models, you're not allowed to talk about instruction. You talk about kids, what they're learning and what they don't learn and things like that. But we don't look at what do we know about effective instruction? And we don't think there's anything wrong. We need to know, did we impact student learning? And if we didn't, are we willing to examine our teaching? And before we fail, what if we talk about what's the best way we know how to do this? Is there any evidence for how we're going to move learning forward? So when we think about PLC, what sets the PLC Plus apart is you, the teacher. Your learning, your professional growth, your development, and your reflection on your teaching. As we think about this, we have 5 questions that drive the conversations that professional learning communities have with their members. The first question is, where are we going? Where is this group of students going in their learning? Which includes some conversations about vertical and horizontal alignment. We're going to go into more detail on each of these questions after we overview them, but where are we going? Where is the learning going next with students? Following this question, we talk about where are we now? One of my reflections after a long time of doing this work is we take credit for students learning without knowing where they started. And perhaps they learned it last year or from someone else in another location. If we don't know where students are now and where they need to go, we might take false credit. We might have gaps and redundancies. We have to know where our students are now, where we need to get them, because we teach in the gap between what students already know and what they need to know. The third question that we think about is, how do we move learning forward? What would be the most intentional action teachers and teams could take that have a high likelihood of impacting learning? Yes, we do think time should be spent in professional learning communities talking about instruction. But we don't admire instruction so much that we don't talk about anything else. We do need to have other conversations, but one of the 5 questions allows teams, encourages teams to have conversations about moving learning forward before it's too late. We eventually get to, what did we learn today? Did we check for understanding? Do we have any analysis of student performance? Do we need to go back and reteach? But if we only use a failure first model and we only talk about what kids didn't learn as a result of it, we end up repeating that cycle over and over. We need to have some amount of time spent in an initial conversation about what's the best evidence. As a literacy person, here's an example. If a group of teachers say, here's some things kids need to learn, and the best way we think that we're going to do this is by round robin reading, they probably need to look at some of the evidence. This is not an effective approach to get kids to improve their literacy achievement. But it happens all the time because professional learning communities are not encouraged to think about, how do I move learning forward? Is there any evidence for the instructional path that I've chosen? And then looking at the data, what did we learn today? Which takes us to the 5th question. Who benefited and who did not benefit? Which forces us to look at trend data, to look at equity outcomes and equity initiatives. Too often, we look at individual students and we might even blame them for their lack of achievement. But we don't see in the last iterations of professional learning communities the trend data conversations about groups of students who need barriers removed or supplemental and intensive support. We have to get to the point where we're willing to confront the data in front of us, the equity data, to have conversations about getting kids learning at higher levels. Across these 5 questions, we have identified some cross-cutting themes. Every question includes work in these 4 areas across the 5 questions. The first is activators. As many of you noted in your discussion, there are not enough protocols, there are not enough discussion drivers, there are not enough structures in place in many professional learning communities. And we don't like the word facilitator because it seems to us the definition of facilitator is that you can't contribute to the conversation when you are the facilitator. A true facilitator facilitates others. We say activator because someone needs to activate the learning in that learning community. And that role can change. That role can be one person across the semester or a year. It does not have to be the leadership. It can be a teacher. Second cross-cutting theme or value that we have is that we have to have high expectations. There's a tyranny of low expectations that can occur. This is good enough. And we need to look at the expectations every member of our team has for the learning outcomes of students. I also talked about equity already. Looking at trend data to remove barriers and provide supplemental and intensive support for students requires that we look at the equity issue and inequities that occur. And the last theme is to individual and collective efficacy. And for those of you who followed John Hattie's work, collective teacher efficacy has the highest impact of everything we know, 252 things. Collective teacher efficacy has the highest impact on students' learning. And there's good reason for that. When teachers come together and they have procedures in place, structures in place, protocols in place, and they have high expectations for themselves and their learners, and they build that sense of collective, we are in this and we can do this, nothing stops them. These themes are important to consider in each question. These 5 questions drive the conversations, but they don't occur in a linear order. Different meetings could talk about different numbers of these questions. We don't say, you first talk this, then you talk this, then you talk this. We're going to present them in that order, but in a real PLC discussion, you might be talking about what did we learn today and who benefited? What do they still need to learn? You might have lots of those kinds of conversations. Now we'll go more in depth in each of the 5 questions.
So let's take a closer look at where are we going. The first question we're going to talk about, but again, these go in very different orders depending on the needs of the PLC, focuses on the need for clarity about learning. What is it that we want our students to know, understand, and be able to do? And why is it that this particular piece of content or these process skills are of importance? And what evidence are we going to be looking for in the future to see if the learning did occur in our classrooms, to figure out what our impact is? This derives from the body of research on teacher clarity, which suggests that it almost doubles the rate of learning in the classroom, an effect size of 0.75. So when we talk about clarity, what do we really mean here? One would argue that if I explain it clearly and the students don't get it, well, didn't I fulfill my part of the duty or my part of my responsibility? And so what we want to look at is how this is both a teacher and a student responsibility. How do we have clarity for learning from the teacher's perspective as well as from the student perspective? Without teacher clarity, you don't have student clarity, and student clarity requires us to put in some elbow grease, some work beforehand to unpack what it is we really want our students to learn, understand, and be able to do. And so that's what we mean when we talk about teacher clarity. It's what we need students to learn, and then how we communicate to them what that learning intention is so that they're both aware of what the learning intention is for that day and what the success criteria are associated with that learning intention. Having a 7-year-old at home who's in 1st grade gives me the opportunity to ask her those questions and talk to her about clarity for learning to see if she's understanding what it is that she needs to learn and what success looks like. And so what do I ask her when she gets in the car? When we talk about teacher clarity, how do we know if we've gotten there? How do we know if we're making progress towards teacher clarity? Well, the answer comes in 3 magic questions. And I say magic jokingly, but do we ask our students, what am I learning today? Do we ask them why are they learning this? And do we ask them what they need to know to demonstrate that they've got it? These are things we want our students to not only just read and pull off the board, but internalize that the learning they have has a purpose and that there is a goal, and that's what success looks like. Teacher clarity and student clarity help us formulate the answer for where we are going in the learning. So how do we get to this? How does this happen? Well, in addition to content knowledge that we bring to our classrooms, one of the first places to look are the standards. What do we expect learners to know, understand, and be able to do at the state level or the national level? What's expected here? And so we start with the nouns. And so if I'm going to get my learners to answer those 3 questions, if I'm going to be very versed in where we're going in this classroom, I need to first take a look at the nouns within a standard. Why the nouns? The nouns help us understand the concepts, ideas, big ideas, or principles that are driving this particular piece of content or process skills if you're teaching in the sciences or you're analyzing primary documents in social studies. So the nouns are very, very important to pull out to figure out what kind of knowledge is expected. Is it declarative? Is it factual? What is the application of this factual information? And then under what conditions is this information going to be used? And so let's take a specific example of this and try to unpack it. And unpacking is often the terminology we use in our classrooms and our schools as we dive into standards. If we look at this particular social studies or humanities example, if we go through and pull out the nouns, and when we say nouns, we use that term loosely, they're concepts. And so it's evidence, consequences of territorial expansion, economic expansion, and American Indians. And so it's taking a look at the standard and figuring out this is where we're headed. They're going to have to understand what evidence is and isn't. They're going to have to understand consequences, probably what the difference is between territorial and economic expansion, and in the context of the American Indians. And so this is how we first dive into where are we going. What is it that the students have to learn? Now, I noticed there was a question that just popped up in the chat that said, well, is this primarily focused on teacher learning or student learning? This is an excellent place to put in the PL part of PLCs. If I'm a teacher and this is the particular learning standard that we're focused on in the classroom, right? And this is my unpacking of it. And I look at it and realize, well, I know where the students are going, but I really don't understand the consequences of territorial and economic expansion. I either didn't get that in my teacher preparation program, or this is just something I'm not comfortable with. This might be a chance for me to then pursue professional learning to build a more robust body of content knowledge so that I can better relay this information to my students. So the PL from PLC pops up when there is a gap in our own learning as professionals. And so we engage in learning. So once we know the concepts, if we know the ideas, if we know exactly what it is we're after, the next thing is to figure out what do we have to do with this? What do I expect students to do with this at the end? What does mastery look like? What does proficiency look like? What does progression towards that mastery or proficiency level look like? And for that, we have to dive into the verbs. And again, this is very similar to the unpacking of the standards, but it's taking an in-depth look of where we're going for this particular piece of content or this particular skill development. You'll notice that many of the verbs in the standard speak to skills, partly because of making the content useful. And so we want to make sure that we don't isolate this too much to where it's a verb for the sake of being a verb. But what is it they're supposed to do with the concepts or do with the ideas in that particular standard? How are they going to use this information or find connections? And so if we go back to our standard, we'll notice that it says develop an argument. Well, what does that mean? It means we take these concepts and we're going to have to bring them together in a relational and an application type task or outcome that requires me to develop an argument, which may in and of itself open the door for more learning opportunities for both us and our students. The trick here is to make sure that this is highly visible to our students as well as to us. And so I agree, and I want to put an explanation point on Nancy's comment. Figuring out the skills and the concepts is essential for later questions in the PLC Plus framework. Right now, we are just trying to figure out where we're going and what are we headed towards. And to do that, we have to figure out where the students are going. And then if there's a gap in our own content knowledge or pedagogical content knowledge, then we have to unpack it there and add the PL to the PLC Plus.
In addition to knowing where we're, as part of knowing where we're going, we want to make sure students have an understanding of the success criteria. So we put in a couple examples of success criteria. Some are longer term and some are shorter term. So there's a group of students working collaboratively. They are having a task that they have to complete collaboratively. And this is the success criteria for a group discussion. This is called, for us, an evergreen success criteria. Anytime they work in a group, they're always going to try to achieve this level of success. And they know these words, they're used to them, and they can refer to them anytime they're in a discussion. So that's an evergreen set of success criteria. Alternatively, these students are working on some writing, and their success criteria is very specific for this descriptive paragraph that they're writing. This is a criteria that is unique to this particular task. Both work, and teams come together to figure out what would success look like, which allows us to check our expectations. Do we have high expectations for all of our learners? And have we articulated those expectations, and do they align with the expected learning? The next question is, where are we now? And we do know that a significant percent of minutes, somewhere between 40 and 60, depending on which researchers you read, of instructional minutes are spent on things students have already learned. And if we spend that much time on things they've already mastered, we aren't focused on things they still need to learn. That's why this question is so important for teams to talk about. How will they know what the students already know? Are they going to do an initial assessment, a pre-assessment? Are they going to do a concept map? Are they going to do an anticipation guide? What will they do to make sure they check to see where kids are now in their learning before they march forward with a series of lessons? A simple example might be a single point rubric. Where are students on each of these things in terms of their writing? And they might use this kind of rubric to build out areas that need attention and areas that are already mastered. And if we don't have some ability to answer this question, where are our students now? We run the risk of wasting a lot of instructional time and then taking credit for learning that wasn't a result of our teaching.
You know, I'm a big fan of Mary Poppins, and one of the pieces of wisdom that Mary Poppins offers is that well begun is half done. And in a PLC Plus model, we spend time in really thinking about where is it that we want to go with our students and where are we right now. That's that foundational or beginning work that is so important. Once the team has determined that, we move to that third driving question, which is how do we move learning forward? And what's critical about this is in thinking, first of all, about challenge. How is it that we create challenge for our students? In order for students to deepen their learning, they must have shifts in the tasks that they're doing. In other words, when we're first introducing ideas, we might be at the surface level of learning. They're learning the boundaries and the contours of the content, but it's essential that we change those tasks, make those tasks more challenging in order to be able to deepen their learning. John Hattie refers to this as the Goldilocks challenge. He says, not too hard, not too boring. We have to find that sweet spot in all of that. And here's where that PLC Plus team can once again really take a close look at whether the amount of challenge, the amount of rigor is available. There are many protocols that we have put together within the PLC Plus playbook that accompanies this. And one of those protocols is an assignment analysis. It's important to note that this is not analyzing student work, but rather a PLC Plus team really looking closely at the assignments that they are going to be having students complete, to be able to analyze those in a systematic kind of way to see whether in fact the rigor of those assignments is reaching the level that we want students to be able to accomplish in order to meet that success criteria, in order to be able to deepen learning. These and other strategies are drawn from, as many of you have noted, the work that John Hattie has done around visible learning and visible learning for teachers. That research base represents for us this robust research-based set of strategies. I think one of the drawbacks that can happen, or one of the barriers that can happen in some PLCs that are not operating at optimal levels, is that without intending to, there's a reinforcement of ineffective teaching strategies. PLC Plus is very much grounded in looking at those research-based strategies to be able to utilize those. And if you think about what are the three legs of a stool, for example, that hold up those research-based strategies, it's really these three legs. It's curriculum, it's assessment, but it's also instruction. And when you remove one of those legs, typically the instruction leg, when it comes to some professional learning communities, you create a state of imbalance. In other words, only looking at curriculum and assessment is not sufficient. We have to look deeply at the instructional moves that we utilize. We talk a lot about the importance of moving forward student learning. But we also have to keep in mind within that PLC Plus structure, how is it that we move teacher learning forward? How do we move our own learning forward as well? Among those research-based strategies that we look at is a gradual release of responsibility. There's certainly decades worth of evidence around the importance of each of these steps. And once again, there are protocols that are in place that help teams to be able to support this third driving question. How do we move learning forward? In this case, how do we move our own learning forward? How do we learn as an organization? How do we grow as adults in that organization? And so there are protocols, for example, such as coaching corners. How do teachers within that PLC Plus structure share their practice? Learning walks. How do we as a team walk each other's classrooms and observe each other's classrooms and learn from one another? And another element, another protocol that is associated with this third driving question is around micro-teaching. Micro-teaching has a large evidence base and a strong effect size, but there are lots of folks who don't really know how to implement micro-teaching in ways that are practical and useful. So those are among the protocols that we have that are associated with this third driving question.
So as we move forward to question number 4, and then that will lead us directly into number 5, I want to pause for a moment and respond to a couple of questions that have popped up on the screen. Mark McCann, if you will make sure that at the end of tonight's webinar, if you will email me, I'm going to purchase a copy of the PLC Plus Playbook when it comes out and send it to you, compliments of us. Because you asked a very pointed question and your enthusiasm is contagious. So the protocol for analyzing tasks or assignment analysis is actually going to be in the PLC Plus Playbook. And so once that comes out, I will make sure that you get a copy. Please make sure you reach out so that I can send it to you. One of the things I want to also highlight in these 4 questions, and now moving in, and eventually moving into the 5th question, is the PL part of this. As Nancy and Doug have talked about, the idea of making sure we have a robust body of evidence-based practices, that we are clear what success looks like, that we have a grasp on what we intended to do in our classrooms. That's really where the PL comes in. But the professional learning also pops up in this question explicitly. What did we learn today? And there's 2 ways to think about this. Number 1, what did we learn about our students' learning? What evidence do we have from the day that tells us where they are in their development towards proficiency or mastery? Did they get to the learning intention? Did they get to the success criteria? And this comes through our careful development and construction of checks for understanding. Checking for understanding to make sure students are with us. One of the most commonly used metaphors is this: the cook tastes the soup or the guest tastes the soup. If we wait until the end to find out what has occurred over the past day, week, or unit, we can't be surprised when we are disappointed or shocked at some of the results. Did we check along the way at each point in our learning process, the learning progression? Did we check to see if students got it? Are they with us? Are they making progress? This is a formative assessment, but it can also be summative in nature. Is it assessment for learning, assessment of learning, assessment as learning? We can ask them to engage in dialogue. We can ask them to do nonverbal tasks where they're drawing or they're writing, and that's the written language part of that. We can ask different types of questions. We can ask them to engage in projects or performances. And then finally, we can do tests. And you'll notice that these are nicely arranged in assessment as learning, assessment for learning, and assessment of learning. Having students engage in classroom discussion and talking back and forth using the verbal language or the language learning intention for the day is really assessment as learning. Through engaging in these tasks, they will learn. They will acquire and consolidate this information, but we will also be able to listen to those conversations. And so I'm going to learn on the spot how they're progressing in their in today's learning. The nonverbal language, same way. I can ask them to do things, gestures, any kind of task that gets them to do something with this information is as. Written language and questioning, that's another one. Assessment for learning. So in this case, I'm assessing and I'm looking for their progress. I can take a task at the beginning, a writing task at the beginning, wait a little bit, give it again, wait a little bit, give it again, and I can look at the progression. I can look for the learning in their writing. I can look for the learning in how they answer the questions. Projects and performances and tests, that's the assessment of. We're doing a check at the end to see, did they pull it all together? Even then, I can make decisions based on the previous questions. If I know where we were going, if I know where they started, if I know how I wanted to move learning forward, these checks for understanding bring that learning to the forefront. They make it visible, if you will, so that I can learn as a teacher my impact, and the students themselves can learn about their own learning, which moves them closer to metacognition. Do you check for understanding during the learning process? Do you check for understanding during learning progressions within your own classrooms? I'm going to pause for about 30 seconds and let you think about that. If we were to walk into your classrooms tomorrow, how often do you taste the soup or dip your toe in the water? Or how often do you check for understanding in your own students? Take about 30 seconds and think through that, and then we're going to add some more. So there are lots of questions that have popped up regarding checks for understanding. For example, Denise makes the reference that teachers conduct checks for understanding but may not always know how to respond or to address what is revealed. And that's exactly where we're going next. You can assess all you want, but how you use that assessment is really where you get the biggest bang for your buck. And so one of the things you have to do with these assessments, what we have to do with these assessments each and every day, is look at them in the light of where we're going, where they started, and what I chose to move learning forward with. And so it allows us to do things like, did the child meet the benchmarks or the proficiency marks? If they didn't, are they making progress? And so one of the things that the PLC Plus framework model does is it helps us take the formative assessments and even the summative assessments and put them in the context of the previous questions to make sense of them and to decide where to go next with this information. Because I agree with Denise that if we don't do something with these assessments, they're not going to be of any help to us. Assessments are only as good as the data they provide. And the data it provides is only as helpful as what we do with it in making our next decision. And that brings us to the last one. So what do we do with this information? Question number 5 takes care of what some have commented on in the question menu or the chat room. Who benefited and who did not benefit? This is really the equity piece brought to the forefront. But where did this come from? It comes from the data we collected in the previous question. So let me make sure we're clear on this. Question number 4 helps us learn what our impact has been on students if we've answered the first 3 questions effectively. What we do with that information we collect in question 4 leads us into question 5. I want you to look at the progress and achievement graph that's on the screen. In this case, progress is our horizontal axis and achievement is the vertical axis. And we can put in everything from rubric scores to benchmark assessments to teacher designed assessments. These are all right there. And I can plot it, and we provide a link to this particular macro or Excel spreadsheet that allows you to put in scores and automatically produce this graph. And so something that a teacher may do with this and bring them to his or her PLC and open it up to the group looks at where students fall on this chart. You have students that have high achievement and high progress, and they're in the upper right-hand quadrant. These are the students where they met the achievement benchmarks, and guess what? They had high progress. And if I've made sure that what I taught them they didn't already know, I get to lay claim to the progress they've made. Let's go to the bottom right quadrant. These are students that have low achievement. They didn't necessarily meet the achievement benchmark set up by the district the region, the state, or the nation, but they have made incredible progress. Their growth is incredible. They have grown by leaps and bounds in their learning. And guess what? If I have been careful in knowing where they're going, where they are now, and choosing evidence-based practices to move that learning forward, this is evidence of my impact that I can then lay claim to and say, yes, I did it. This is how I build efficacy. This is how we as a team build collective efficacy, by showing that we had an impact on student learning. But then there's another part of this. If you move across the y-axis into the upper left, these are students that have high achievement, low progress. These are learners that met every benchmark we threw at them, but didn't show any progress during their time with us. This is what Doug refers to as taking credit for learning that's not ours. This requires us to think long and hard about our answer to question number 3. What did I choose to move learning forward? And really, was it a wise choice? It also asks me to take a very close look at question number 2. Did I really know where they were? Did I spend 60% of my time on something they already knew? The PLC Plus framework brings those conversations to light. The bottom left is the one that causes us anxiety, and it should. These are students that not only didn't achieve, but they didn't show any progress. And to be very blunt, what we decided to do in our classrooms did not work. These learners, just like the learners above them in high achievement, low progress, did not benefit from our instruction. And one of the things to focus on here is why? What decisions did I make, and why didn't they have a greater effect on student learning? This is very, very, very important, especially in terms of equity. What happens if all of the students that showed low progress all had IEPs? What happens if all of the students that showed low progress were Hispanic? What happens if all of the students that showed low progress were males in my science class or males in my English classroom? This suggests we have an equity issue, and this is something as a PLC Plus team we can address. It's also where we can put in some of our own professional learning. Maybe I just don't have the skill set that I need to effectively work with a certain learner. Maybe I didn't get that from my teacher training. This is the professional learning we engage in. And by the way, I work in teacher preparation programs, so all of my slides at Teacher Ed are actually me talking about my own classroom. So how does this work? What's the big idea behind all of this? The PLC Plus framework through the 5 questions builds collective teacher efficacy. Well, why? Well, it takes a look at what we would refer to as problems of practice. It brings together the collective thinking of the group and develops solutions based on that collective thinking of the group. And so one of the best ways to build collective efficacy is to engage in mastery experiences, engage in vicarious learning, to engage in social persuasion or peer pressure, and then to get feedback. And the PLC Plus builds that by going through these 5 questions and looking at who did and did not benefit and addressing those equity issues or those challenges. I'm going to pause for just a moment and let you process where we are at this point. We have about 15 minutes left in the webinar, but I want to give you just a chance to think through the 5 questions. We've been through all 5, and you've gotten a taste of what this looks like. If you have some questions, throw them into the chat room and we will address them as they pop up. Jennifer asked, what do you do if they don't teach the same thing? This is interesting. In this case, a lot of the information would then focus on what they do teach, what their measures of success are, and working collectively to address problems within each discipline. So let's say I'm in a PLC team where I'm the only math teacher. I may ask my colleagues to give me feedback on how I've constructed my learning intentions and success criteria as I give them feedback on how they may have constructed them in social studies or the humanities. It also means we get to look at learners across content areas, not just in mathematics. And so if we teach different things, the focus then is going to be on the learner's progression and getting feedback and getting professional learning information on my teaching in my particular area. What foundational work needs to be established? Stephanie asked foundational work. One of the things we think absolutely has to be there is teacher credibility. Teacher credibility is absolutely paramount in this. Do teachers have the credibility with their students? Do they, are they trustworthy? Do they demonstrate that they care? Do they have the dynamism, the personality to engage with learners? Do learners believe that they're there for their own or for the betterment of their learning? And so teacher credibility is one. Individual efficacy is another, and collective efficacy is a third. And one of the things we address in both the book and the playbook, which are due out in the next month, is how to build that if that's not present. So Stephanie, if you're on a PLC Plus team and there's not a lot of credibility, there's not a lot of efficacy in the team, we have suggested ways to do that in both of those pieces of work. And those things have to be done before you dive into working through the 5 questions. Otherwise, the 5 questions will turn into a worksheet or a wrestling match during a planning period. Penny asked, there are so many standards to use to find out where they are going. Our suggestion is find the standards of learning associated with your particular district or state, whether it's Common Core, the next generation science standards, or something unique to the state. For example, in Florida, the next generation Sunshine State science standards. If you can say that 10 times fast, go for it. If you're in Virginia, we have a unique set of state standards and did not adopt next generation and did not adopt Common Core. And so we have very clear standards. Patsy asked about, do we have any tips for getting teachers to recognize they're not holding high enough expectations for students? The answer is yes. And for that, we're going to kick back to a previous slide. Let's see if I can get to it. It would be this one. One of the things that we would point out is if you analyze data. So what did you learn today? Who benefited and who did not benefit? One of the things to do is look at who's in the quadrants associated with low progress. Who's in the quadrant associated with low achievement? And is it an expectation issue? In other words, we asked them to do certain things. They did those certain things, but those expectations fell short of what was expected of them at the state or national level. So these questions funnel that conversation to the forefront, and some of the outcomes would suggest we're just not holding them to high expectations. Jennifer asked the $1 million question, and hopefully the internet will go out before I try to answer it because it's the hardest question of the night. How do you get defensive or insecure teachers on board with a PLC Plus mindset? That's a great question. I have 2 personal suggestions that I can share with you from my own experience. In one situation, I was the defensive and insecure teacher. In another situation, I was not. In both situations, what worked for me was that teacher actually became the activator. And I chuckle because we have to be careful with this. Sometimes if you have a resistant or an insecure colleague, putting them in charge and giving them control of it will help, because in many cases, they just want to be validated that what they're doing in their classroom that they work very hard at doing isn't something they have to throw completely out. So the first thing would be make them an activator, give them a role in this process. Number 2 is help identify where they are experiencing mastery, where they are experiencing success in their classroom, and celebrate that. Shannon, just a reminder, the Excel graph used to create the quadrant. There's a link to that will be provided in both books that will give you the template where you plug in your numbers and bang, out comes the quadrants. What you'll notice is the number in red, 0.34, is the average effect size for this class. And so to the right, they're above it. To the left, they're not. 68.43, the number in green, is the average score on whatever achievement you put in, whether it's a writing rubric, a laboratory rubric, a social emotional checklist, whatever qualitative or quantitative data you have converted to a score is on that line as well. So as we wind down, before we hand it back over, I want to spend just a few moments talking about the role of efficacy in this. Someone asked the foundational ideas of PLCs, and wow, it's credibility, individual efficacy, and collective efficacy. But if it's not there, it doesn't mean that we can't do the PLC plus. The model and the framework was designed to build credibility and efficacy, because at the end of the day, it's the belief in my own agency to do something in my classroom and get the results that I want. It's also about sitting with a room full of individuals and recognizing that when I do something in my classroom and it doesn't produce the results I want, there's someone in the room that can help me. And they want to help me not because they want to point out my flaws, but they want to help me because they know we're in this together. That's the efficacy that this framework seeks to build. If it's not there in the beginning, we want to foster it, but this framework will nurture it and then we'll help pass it on. Do you as a group believe that you have the collective ability to promote student success in school? I will tell you, one of the benefits of working on this team with Doug and Nancy is the level of collective efficacy. If I can't find an answer or can't think through a problem, I kick it to them and we kick it around together, because someone in the room collectively can help us promote success in what we do. And as noted before, it is the highest effect size in John Hattie's list. It has an effect size of 1.47. If we were to translate that, it more than quadruples the rate of learning in your classroom. Jill, the protocols to support PLC Plus will be in the PLC Plus playbook. And I assure you, I want to get my hands on the finished products as much as you do. We have gone through the proofs and gone through the edits, and they should be going to press in the next day or so, which means they're off and running. There is one question I do want to ask or answer before I hand it back over. Arlene, and I apologize if I didn't say your name correctly. The data conversation for small districts where there's only one grade level teacher. I live in those districts. I live in rural Virginia, south of Harrisonburg, west of Charlottesville. And some of our schools are very big, but we still have those schools out in rural parts of our county where there's one first grade teacher, there's one second grade teacher, there's one third. At this point, it allows us to have two different conversations that larger schools may not have the logistics or the capacity to do. And that is look at students from K to 5. I can sit in a room with third grade teachers and as a fourth grade teacher, use data on where they are to help better decide where they are with me and where I'm going to move them next in my classrooms. And so I would say, don't shy away from data conversations and vertical alignment conversations in small districts. If you have one grade level teacher, I would say vertical planning should be an absolute must, because you can get everybody in the same conference room with one pot of coffee, one box of Dunkin' Donuts, and get the same impact, if not a greater impact, on student learning. I believe we may have time for a couple more questions, but not many. How are PLC Plus teams different from impact teams? I don't really know. And let me clarify that. I know that's not what you expected as the answer. I do not know all of the intimate components and the specifics of impact teams, but I can tell you PLC Plus teams are built on a model that allows you to execute them in whatever time frame you are allotted. It also focuses on credibility, efficacy, and moving learning forward from the teaching aspect. And so much like PLCs of the past, it takes what we already do by focusing on student learning and adds in the teacher learning. My guess is that would be the difference. Diane, that's a great question. And I would say that's part of the professional learning journey, specifically with question number 3 and 4. So what did I choose to move learning forward? And then question 4 is, what did I learn? And if you have a bunch of data, but you didn't learn anything from the data, or you look at the data and can't make any inferences about who did benefit and who did not benefit, or someone in the room says that doesn't make sense to me because I saw them do X, Y, and Z, but in your class, they could not do X, Y, and Z. That brings up the conversation of data not telling us something. And I believe the PLC Plus framework opens the door for those conversations through the data analysis protocol. I don't just believe it, I know it. It was designed for that. It should force us to collect better data. Absolutely, I can look at question 5 again. Who benefited and who did not benefit? Mauricio, that's a great question. And there is a segment in the PLC Plus playbook and the book that talks about how to differentiate the tasks. Differentiation I use carefully, but it talks about how to tier instruction so that you can meet the needs of all learners, regardless of where they are in terms of their own agency, social emotional development, as well as the 3 prongs of the stool: curriculum, instruction, and assessment. And I know that was an earlier question. It does address that. It does not make the statement of personalized learning. What it talks about is the differentiation of instruction so that all learners have the possibility and the opportunity and access to the learning. You're welcome.
All right, so this is Dina again, and I wanted to thank you, John, Nancy, and Doug. Again, this was a wonderful presentation full of lots of information, and I have a feeling everybody is super excited, invigorated, ready to go out and learn more about PLC Plus. And I've seen lots of questions about what resources do we have, what can I do next? So we do have some next steps for you. They don't need to be in any special order, but I'll go a little deeper into each step here on the next slide. First, you can read, we have 2 books coming out. June 6th is the publishing date, but you can order them now at corwin.com/PLC Plus. It's PLC Plus, the core book, Better Decisions and Greater Impact by Design. Will give you a brief history of PLCs, introduce the framework, go more deeper about the questions and cross-cutting themes, and show the PLC in action in various settings. The PLC Plus Playbook, which John mentioned several times, will give you that practical hands-on guide to implementing your full PLC Plus cycle. There's modules comprising of a lot of tools that support your implementation. And then a few months later, we will also have a 3rd book, the Activators Guide, the PLC Plus Activators Guide, which will provide guidance for those people that are the team activators and give you a guide to overcoming obstacles and having difficult conversations in your groups. So those, again, are available. You can order them now. They will be shipping out after they're published on June 6th. On the next slide, we go into a little bit about that. Corwin offers institutes. Take a look at these cities, if there's one nearby, which there's some awesome locations here. And because you attended this webinar today, use the code webinars19 for $50 off your registration. And you can get more information, look at the agendas at corwin.com/institutes. And those are all PLC Plus institutes. And then finally, we also offer on-site professional development series around PLC Plus. You can learn more about the PD series and actually even schedule a lunch and learn with Jan Achteroff. And you can contact Jan at jan.achteroff@corwin.com for more information on scheduling a lunch and learn and about a deeper dive into the information on the professional development series. So just lastly, I wanted to let you know that you will be receiving an email which will act as your certificate of completion with a link to the recording and the slides of this webinar, and you're free to share any of this with any of your colleagues. So with that, I just want to tell you to thank you so much for joining us and have a wonderful Monday evening.